Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting a little bit while people get on, and then we'll get things underway. We've got a lot for you. Peter Mann from Australia. Uncle Nico. If you guys don't know, if you see Uncle Nico in the chat there, he's got a podcast he does on sleep and CPAP. He's got about 150,000 followers, I think. Does a great job. Recently did an interview with Dr. William Noah that you should check out. You can find that on YouTube. We got New Zealand in the house. Welcome to Sleep World Magazine Discoveries in Sleep Apnea webinar series, sponsored by SleepRes. I'm your host, Michael DiDomenico, the publisher of Sleep World Magazine. It's great to have you here tonight. Thank you for spending your Wednesday night with us. Welcome, Dr. Berry.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Tonight I'm going to talk about APAP treatment, challenges, and opportunities. But we could characterize APAP using these terms. The good is that many patients are well treated by APAP with lower cost and earlier treatment access than with traditional approaches. The bad, some patients are not well treated, and we may not always know who they are. An elevated residual AHI is often not correct. However, events are also underscored by APAP devices in some patients, and the delivered pressure is too low. The ugly is that some MDs may not understand the limitations of APAP and that treatment algorithms can differ considerably between devices. And even uglier, there's access to detailed flow and pressure waveform data is limited. Using consumer PAP software, a patient may actually have more information about their PAP treatment than their MD. So this audience is sophisticated. I know you're all familiar with the uses of APAP. In the beginning, APAP was used mainly for auto titration, followed by CPAP treatment. But today, chronic APAP treatment with or without a prior PSG titration is usually what's performed. And the idea is you would deliver the lowest effective pressure. So APAP usually does reduce the average and median pressure, and in some studies, the amount of leak. The idea is that lower pressure might be effective during portions of the night, for example, non-supine positions or non-REM sleep. APAP can reduce bloating and aerophagia and pressure intolerance in some patients. Now, when it was developed, it was hoped or thought that APAP would improve adherence. However, studies have not shown an improvement in adherence compared to fixed CPAP, although APAP results in similar adherence and improvement in the AHI, Epworth Sleepiness Scale, and other outcomes when compared to fixed CPAP. So in other words, it might not be better, but it is no worse. This, I'm showing some of the results from a large meta-analysis done by a task force of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. On the left is APAP versus CPAP for the AHI, and on the right, APAP versus CPAP for adherence. And if you look at the pool group estimate for both of these, it's essentially zero. Therefore, they're pretty equivalent. APAP had an AHI about 0.56 higher, and use was about 11 minutes longer, but obviously neither of these are really clinically significant. So based on this meta-analysis, this was the clinical practice guideline. We recommend that PAP therapy be initiated using either APAP or home in-laboratory PAP at home, or laboratory PAP titration in adults with OSA and no significant comorbidities. And here are listed the comorbidities that really mean the patient should have a PSG titration. Now, the authors of the clinical practice guidelines also carefully pointed out that the clinical trials reviewed provided mask fitting, education in the sleep center, or the location of the PAP setup with very close follow-up. And so my comment is that these recommendations may not be relevant to patients started on APAP by non-sleep MDs or without good clinical, good support, and especially at treatment initiation. So let's talk about APAP challenges. Okay, The challenges for the makers of APAP include an accurate event detection based entirely on flow, effective titration algorithms for a wide spectrum of patients, provide data on adherence, pressure, leak, and residual event frequency and apnea type with provider education on how to use the reports. And I'm adding another challenge: improve access to detailed waveform data, that is flow and pressure, and educate physicians on how to use this information. Now, for physicians, there are a number of challenges. First of all, interpretation of complex download reports. Different brands use different formats and event definitions. Appreciation that the device AHI is based only on flow and may not always be accurate. Different algorithms deliver very different amounts of pressure. In some patients, too little, and in others, too much. So as physicians, we have to adjust the settings. Limited access to detailed waveform data that can help verify that the residual AHI is correct and the delivered pressure is appropriate. And on the right, I have a little cartoon of a physician. You notice he has a frown on his face, pushing the APAP up the hill toward treatment success. And he says, how can I, or she says, how can I find out if event scoring and pressure delivery are correct? Well, the answer is better and more easily accessible information about the PAP, what the PAP device is doing. But if you didn't already know it, it turns out that computer savvy patient on APAP may already have more information than the sleep physician. There are two sources: Oscar, open source CPAP analysis reporter, formerly Sleepyhead. It's an open source program. You can download it for free. The patient imports data from an SD card into the program. It shows detailed pressure, leak, and flow every breath information, as well as event flags, that is device scored events. It can import oximetry data from consumer devices. Also, Sleep HQ. It has its basic services are free. Premium, there's a monthly fee. The patient uploads data from SD card to a cloud-based program. It also shows detailed flow and event information, as well as pressure information. And it can import oximetry, and most recently can actually import estimates of sleep staging from the Apple Watch, which is interesting. So everyone here is probably aware of the available APAP information. Cloud-based programs, which I'm sure you're aware of. You can get data there by modem or data card upload, and they provide summary and detailed single night reports. And for many patients, this is sufficient. And I list some links there. I found the guide on AirView especially useful. However, the availability of detailed waveform information is more limited. For Phillips Respironics, waveform data is available for selected nights, usually the last night or every 7 days. For ResMed, detailed data is not available on AirView. I understand that they're working on this. However, if you wish, you can download ResScan after registering on their website, and this program reads data cards with the option to upload detailed data. So why am I harping on detailed waveforms? Well, there are benefits from detailed waveforms, pressure, and leak information. First of all, you could determine the accuracy of event detection. So if you disagree with a few of the events, it's not important. But what you can see is if there's large numbers of events or underscored events or overscored events. The second thing is you can look at information about pressure increases or lack of increases. Is the device appropriately increasing pressure? You can see information about intermittent leak, because many times there's short periods of leak that interrupt sleep or prevent the device from being effective, and it doesn't increase overall leak. Both PR and ResMed now determine the amount of Cheyne-Stokes breathing, but of course this needs to be verified by direct observation of waveforms. And I show an example here of the amount of Cheyne-Stokes breathing in a ResMed report. So here is a detailed waveform data from the Care Orchestrator program. Now I have tremendously enlarged it. If you look off to the right, when you get a page, each page has an hour of data, and the actual waveforms are pretty small, but I've enlarged it. So each line is 1 minute. Excuse me, each line is 6 minutes. Each of these portions is 1 minute. The blue is flow and the red is pressure. And so you can see during this period changes in flow. You can also see the event tags. Now it turns out that the program will also show shaded areas when there's periodic breathing or high leak. Okay. So for years, I wondered about these little dots. I kept seeing them and I asked people, I couldn't get an answer. But it appears that when the dots are far apart, that is part of pressure searches that we'll talk about. And when the dots are close together, that is a pressure change in response to an event. Here is an example of data from the ResScan program using the SD card. And there's definitely a little bit of a learning curve here. Anybody interested in this, I would be glad to help. Also, there are people at ResMed that will be glad to help. So really you have two windows. And this window is 8 hours, so it gives you an overview. And this window is detailed, and it's 5 minutes. So up here, you can see pressure varying between the maximum and the minimum pressure limits. And you can see, of course, that it was restrained at this point. You can see the events. Here it's scored as a central event. And this little window here corresponds to this entire window below. So this shows flow limitation, and pressure. So here, this was this central event. And so there was really no change in pressure here. However, you notice there was flow limitation increases. And with the flow limitation increases, there was an increase in pressure. Now, in addition to the high resolution flow data, the machine actually stores high resolution pressure data that I'll show you, but in fact, it's not available in ResScan. Okay, now let's talk about the alternatives. So here is an Oscar daily view of a PR a-pap device. And so it gives you the AHI, all the usual parameters. It tells you what the settings were and so on. And at top, you see a whole night event flags. And you can click on part of it and zoom in. So this little white area here corresponds to this zoomed area. So here you can see a nice detailed flow rate. You can see pressure and leak, and you can see the event flags. Here we're going to talk about the pressure pulse. This shows a pressure pulse, and you can see there was a flow response. So that's why it's a clear airway apnea, and no response. That's why it's an obstructive apnea. You can also see leak. For Phillips devices, there's total leak and unintentional leak. Now down at the bottom, I'm showing 2 hypopneas that were scored during a period of irregular breathing. So if a lot of these occurred, these are, they're not real hypopneas in a sense. They're likely hypopneas that occurred during wait. Here's an example of how the leak information is useful. Here is a change in flow, and it's associated with an increase in leak. Now, to generate this, because I had nothing better to do, one night I breathed on a PAP and simulated oral venting during exhalation. And you can see it there. And you can see that the expiratory part is truncated. And that's, typical of oral venting. Here's a ResMed device. And you can see that it does show very detailed mask pressure, high resolution mask pressure. It also shows low resolution mask pressure. Okay, these are some tracings from Sleep HQ, and you can clearly see very nice waveform of the flow. You can see the airflow limitation. You can see the scored events. And you can also see very obviously the changes in pressure with every event. So in other words, you can determine whether you think that these changes were appropriate. Now, here is another tracing from a patient with some missed events. So here is the hypopneas that are scored. And for all the world, these look exactly the same. However, they weren't scored. So in other words, in this patient, the events were underscored. Now, this shows you the utility of looking at the waveforms in someone that has a lot of periodic breathing. Here's a really interesting case about a person. This patient came in and we looked at the download and we saw all this periodic breathing and suddenly it went away and we could not figure out why. And so we went into the room and lo and behold, it was due to cardioversion. So we went back and looked at some tracings here and I've showed them on the right, and it's obvious Cheyne-Stokes breathing, most likely with central apneas. Sometimes central apneas weren't scored, but I'm sure this is essentially Cheyne-Stokes breathing with central apnea. So again, this could be useful. Now, not all periodic breathing is Cheyne-Stokes breathing, and so this is useful. Now let's talk about event detection. I show a grain of salt. Event detection, as I've said several times, is based only on flow. So the major issues are scoring events during wait, scoring changes in flow as hypopneas without associated desaturation, not scoring events during periods of irregular breathing, because it's hard to define baseline breathing. There's always a comparison with baseline breathing, and that can affect the ability to score events. What is the solution? I would claim the review of detailed waveform data, ideally with synchronized oximetry. So here's a meta-analysis of event detection by a-pap devices. And overall, the AHI by PSG and the AHI by flow are very similar. However, there was wide variability in these studies, and certainly in a good number of patients, the AHI is either too low or too high. So here is a study that we did that we could actually look at event by event analysis. So this was patient data from a previous study in 50 patients sleeping on a-pap set to a lower level so that events would occur. The device actually, very interestingly, output a signal every time it noted an AED event. So if the device detected an event, it sent a signal. Now the PSGs could be blindly scored, so the scorer didn't see these, but we could see them both, and we would go through and do a comparison, event by event comparison. So here a hypopnea had 2 volts, 1.5 seconds, snoring 4 volts, and an apnea. So in other words, this enabled us to have the scoring of the PSG and then see what the synchronized with what the device did. So this is sort of a summary. So the true positive AED events were when both agreed on the event. A false positive event was an AED event when there was no PSG event, or an AED event a good period of time before a PSG event. Now, false negative was when no AED was scored and PSG event was scored. And then an estimate of the true negatives was when neither one were scored. So this is, a typical table showing agreement. So here's AED, here's PSG, event. So this is agreement. Both PSG and AED event scored an event. Here's agreement that neither one of them scored an event. And of course, this is going to be very high because the overall amount of events just really wasn't that high. But what's more interesting is the false positives and the false negatives. So if you compute the positive predictive value, it's only about 50%. Now, why is that? Well, it's due to the high false positive events, and I will show you that hypopneas usually are scored when there's no desaturation. And the same results were true of the AHI AED and the AHI PSG. In other words, when the AHI AED was high, it was only right about 50% of the time. So here are examples of a false positive AED event and a false negative AED event. So this is the little signal that apnea was scored, and I added an H here. This is C flow, and inspiration is downward. And so this was scored as a hypopnea based on flow. However, there was no significant desat, so PSG apnea was not scored. For the false negative one, PSG event was scored because based on this change in flow and the associated desaturation. However, the AED did not score an event. And in REM, this is a challenge because the ventilation is so irregular, and this may not actually meet the criteria in the program. So this happens, and you score PSGs, you can see that sometimes the events in the flow are not that discrete, but they are certainly associated with a desaturation. Now, here is a tracing from Sleep HQ in which the person had synchronized Apple Watch. And here's REM sleep, and here is wakefulness. And you see in REM sleep, this is the flow. It is irregular, as very typical of REM sleep. And then, over here, it is really irregular. And so this wouldn't be exactly typical of REM sleep. And in fact, the patient was awake. So all these OA events were likely not true events. They were simply due to the scoring of irregular breathing during wake. Now, this slide, again, sort of emphasizes that hypopnea detection without oxygen saturation is just problematic, and that synchronized oximetry information will definitely improve scoring accuracy. So here are some hypopneas. Now, the WellU oximeter was used, and then it was up the night of the study, and it was uploaded into OSCAR. So one could see the airflow, one could see the SaO2. And here, probably these aren't very impressive hypopneas anyway. In fact, we might have just disagreed with them without any other information, but certainly there is no significant desaturation. On the other hand, here's an event that was associated with a desaturation. So that, in other words, this is helpful when you're scoring these events that would be scored as hypopneas. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's talk about the classification of airway type, but it's really airway status because respiratory effort is really not available. So CA really means clear airway apnea, and OA really means obstructive airway apnea. So let's look on the left. These are the PR method, uses a pressure pulse. So after there's no flow for a period of time in the range of 4 to 6 seconds, there's a pressure pulse. And if there's flow, the airway is clear or open. Again, no flow, pressure pulse, and this time no flow, and so that is scored as an obstructive airway apnea. And this is actually tracings from their detailed waveform data. This little red is the pressure pulse, and you can see, or maybe hopefully can see, there's actually a change. There's some flow. And here I actually blew it up. So sometimes looking at these waveforms, they're not very big, and waveform data, it is hard sometimes to really see whether you believe that there was flow or not. So with the pressure pulse. So ResMed uses the force oscillation technique. The device generates a pressure of 4 hertz, pulse oscillation technique, after about 4 seconds of no flow. So here's flow, here's pressure. After 4 seconds, it starts giving the force oscillations. And if they show up in the flow, that's considered a clear airway apnea. Now, again, I'd like to emphasize the airway status is determined early, but the event is not scored unless the event is an adequate duration. And here is an obstructive apnea. Again, the airway fluctuation, the pressure fluctuations, and no change in flow. You could also notice something that's also interesting, that actually in the pressure tracing, when the airway is obstructed, the actual pressure fluctuations that you see tend to be larger. Okay, so let's talk about, are these things accurate? Well, this is a study of upper airway status and using a current generation PAP device. 40 patients with OSA and complex sleep apnea were monitored with PSG, by PSG with a CPAP, levels adjusted to induce events. And a pressure pulse was used, as I mentioned, and classification was compared to PSG scoring. So the event would say clear airway apnea, the PSG scoring would say central apnea. So these are the device obstructive apneas. And 21% of the device OAs were actually central apneas by PSG. So these are likely closed airway central apneas. The device detected clear airway apneas. Only 62% of the device classified clear airway apneas were really scored as central apneas by PSG. So what we could say is, if you see a lot of CA events on your download, you have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt, but certainly it would alert you to the possibility that there are some events. So it is useful, but it is not always accurate. Why? Why are they trying to determine this? Well, the whole idea is you don't want to increase pressure for a clear airway apnea. Now here's ResMed, actual tracings here. This is the forced oscillations, and this is the flow rate, and there's not much activity up here. And so it was classified as an OA event, and pressure actually increased. Here, there was forced oscillations, and there was some flow. So it was classified as a clear airway apnea, and there was no pressure increase. So I think this is sort of cool to be able to see this. And the other thing is, you notice, like, as I mentioned, that even for the given amount of forced oscillations, it turns out that the mass pressure is higher in obstructive events. In other words, the mass fluctuations, and I'm sure that's due to the airway being obstructed. Okay, so we're next going to talk about algorithm challenges. So if the pressure increases are too aggressive, it can cause arousals, mass leak, mouth leak, may precipitate central apneas, or end up with a higher 90% or 95% pressure than is really needed. If pressure increases are too conservative, you can have events before adequate pressure is reached. There could be long periods of a persistent airflow limitation followed by arousal because the device isn't titrating up enough. Events could also occur following abrupt transitions to supine or REM sleep. So you're non-REM sleep, you're at CPAP of a pressure of 8 or APAP of 8, and all of a sudden you go into REM. Well, you're going to need 9 or 10, but it's not going to happen right away. So you could have a bunch of events. How do you handle that? You would increase the lower pressure limit. Now, there's a need to avoid responses in airflow for weight. And there's a question, should there be different algorithms for different patients? ResMed has a standard and a soft response and a for her algorithm. And so physicians differ in their opinion about these different ones. Several physicians feel that the soft response is really soft. So how can you compare two units? Well, bench testing is a good way to do this. So this is a very nice article, and they used an artificial lung that they could set the pattern. They used a Starling resistance so that they could cause airway limitation or obstruction. They used a valve to introduce unintentional leak. Now you remember total leak is equal to intentional leak from the mask ports and unintentional leak. So this was introducing unintentional leak, and then the a-pap device was connected. Now the leak was fairly substantial. This shows the pressures, and the leak went up. So on the right, this shows the results. So this is an AirSense 10. These are 12 obstructive apneas that were, and you can see that the device actually titrated up rapidly to the maximum pressure. However, when there was leak, there was no increase in pressure. And in fact, there was a small decrease. And this is part of their algorithm. And the thought is you don't want to increase pressure if there's a very large leak. Here's a dream station. Again, the pressure titrates up, but much less aggressively. Now, it continues to titrate when there's leak, although the pressure at after any given number of OAs is a little bit lower. So here we have an aggressive device, and here we have a less aggressive device. Now, in this study, there was actually one in the middle. It's not available in the United States, but there's certainly certainly a market for one. So how about the a-pap algorithm? What do? Well, they do, it's when you first read it, it's a little confusing, but they actually defined a breathing index based on the square root of the variance in flow. So this is you probably remember your statistics. I here is 2 times the sampling rate. And so each of these is a digitized event. Either it goes from 1 to I or 0 to I minus 1. So this is actually the square root of the variance over 2 seconds. Now, why do they use this? Well, it turns out that this is less problematic when you have varying leak, because when you have varying leak, it is very hard to actually determine the flow, because it's very difficult sometimes to determine the start of inspiration and the end of expiration. So they do 2 ventilation measurements. They do the moving time average of the breathing index, and they actually do measure the absolute flow, and they use that to determine airflow limitation. So what is their comparison? 60 seconds of moving time average of the breathing index, and an apnea is defined as less than 25% of the baseline comparison for at least 10 seconds. So in other words, moving time average of the 2-second square root of variance, and it has to be less than 25% for 10 seconds. The hypopnea definition is interesting. So they do it a little differently. They take a 12-second moving time average, and it should be 10 seconds, but it should be 25 to 50% of the baseline, and it should have 1 obstructive breath. Now, flow limitation detection is done by each breath. They have various things that they compute. They also have, as I mentioned, unknown apneas. Now, unknown apneas are apneas with an unintentional leak greater than 30. And most of you know that their high leak, considered high leak in ResMed devices, is a 95% unintentional leak greater than 24 liters per minute. And by the way, I just want to mention that this is a very nice article by Dr. Friedman and Johnson. I can't believe all the details they found. So anyway, here is the ResMed response. As I mentioned, standard soft for her. So for each obstructive apnea, there's an increase in pressure based on apnea length and the starting pressure. The lower the starting pressure and the longer the apnea duration, the greater the pressure increase. Now, hypopneas are detected, but they're not addressed. Instead, it targets the airflow limitation and snoring associated with the hypopneas. And so the goal here is not to increase pressure for central hypopneas. How about airflow limitation? Again, they compute this. It actually over several breaths, they get an average. They have a higher pressure increment for severely flow limited events. Now, the standard algorithm is a little question whether this is 2 or 3 flow limitation breaths, but anyway, it's not many. And see, it's a 0.5 centimeter increase in pressure per breath. So if you have several breaths that are flow limited, you will get a good increase in pressure. And in snoring, there's an increase in pressure as well. And the device also reduces pressure in the absence of events, and it goes all the way down to P-min, but over these periods of time. So let's look at the ArrestMed device and their change in pressure. All right, so here is an obstructive apnea. There's the forced oscillation technique, and sure enough, this is scored as an obstructive apnea, and there is definitely a pressure. Now, one of these, this person was on EPR, so there's two pressures. So there's an obstructive apnea, so it increased. Just one. There's two hypopneas, and it increased, but not as much. Little incremental increases, and these are due to, like I say, the airflow limitation or the snoring. Here's another obstructive apnea, and it increased again. However, it ran into the upper pressure limit, so that happens. Over here, there are events during a period of very high flow. So, very high leak, excuse me. So here, this was an OA event, and these are all not, they look exactly like OA events, but they're classified as UA events because there's high leak. This is the 24 liters per minute, and you can see it's certainly in the 30 range. And Oscar and actually the waveforms in Phillips, they showed shading when there's high leak. Here is a response to airflow limitation. Here you see some airflow limited breaths, and you can see a flow limitation index, and then the pressure increases. This is the low resolution pressure. This is the high resolution pressure. So this is almost a 4 centimeter of water increase. So in other words, have to keep in mind that the device aggressively treats airflow limitation. So if you had a patient that was on already very high pressure and he has some flow, or she has some flow limitation, and it goes all the way up to 20, the patient can't stand it, there's leak, you might consider saying, well, I'll accept a little bit of airflow limitation. Although in this case, you have to admit that the airflow did improve after the higher pressure. Now, the Phillips algorithm uses something called the weighted peak flow, and it's average flow over 20 to 80% of the volume. So if you have a regular old breath, the WPF is about where the peak flow is. If you have a breath like this, where most of it is much lower, the WPF is lower. And so they use the WPF. Their flow comparison is an average of 80-90% WPFs over a 4-minute moving time window. And for an apnea, that's got to be a greater than an 80% reduction for greater than or equal to 10 seconds, terminating with a breath. For hypopnea, it's a 40 to 80% reduction. Again, it has to be for 10 minutes. They do determine airflow limitation, and they do record vibration. They also do something very interesting called the P-op and P-crit that I'll tell you about. So the P-op is a high pressure search. So in other words, the idea is maybe the pressure should be increased so the patient won't develop an apnea. In other words, or hypopnea, it's preemptive. So the pressure increases, and if there's improvement, it stays up, although higher than P therapy, but not all the way up to P-op. If there's no improvement, it goes right back to pre-therapy, P therapy. In other words, before that. This is a low pressure search where it drops the pressure until it sees an event, usually flow limitation, and then it knows you need higher pressure, so it goes back up 1.5 centimeters of water, although it necessarily goes all the way back to the original. And here's actually a waveform data that I've shown showing this P-crit search. And again, as I mentioned, when these two dots are together, that's an increase in pressure. Okay, so this is an example of a Phillips titration, okay? So let me go back and be sure that I emphasized the response. I'm sorry, I skipped this. It's important. So I mentioned P-op and P-crit. It's for apnea and hypopnea. the response is for 2 obstructive apneas, 1 apnea and 1 hypopnea, or 2 hypopneas. The pressure increases by 1 centimeter of water over 15 seconds and then holds. They have some non-responsive logic to prevent the running away. They respond to flow limitation. They respond to snoring, although the increase is not perhaps so vigorous as in the ResMed machine. And for their leak detection, a large leak is greater than 2 times the intentional leak for a given mask and pressure. And if large leak occurs, it reduces the pressure by 1 centimeter of water over 10 seconds and holds. So it turns out these algorithms are extremely complex. So I'm just giving you sort of an overview. Okay, so here are 2 hypopneas, not 1 hypopnea, but 2 hypopneas. And indeed, the pressure increases. We go along here, and there are again 2 hypopneas. So the pressure increases. And again, here is an obstructive apnea, and it must have considered this an event, or so anyway, it increased the pressure. So that was a RERA, and it's characterized by flow limitation increasing and a sudden change in breathing associated with an arousal. And here is the total leak and the unintentional leak that, you know, as you might expect, the unintentional leak does go up with higher pressure. So we now come to the question of, all right, what about the opportunities to make things better? So I would say the PAP device manufacturers have some opportunities. They could provide easily obtained high resolution flow waveforms every night if needed, with episodes of leak and event flags. They could redesign their software, which some like for the Phillips waveforms, they haven't changed in 15 years. So they could design it and take some effort to equal the quality of the consumer PAP programs. There could be more transparency about algorithms. We certainly benefit from bench testing. Different algorithms for different individuals can be helpful, but definitely you need validation studies. I would propose that integration with oximetry is important. Now, this has been available for various machines. However, it wasn't very convenient. It was sort of clunky, and I don't think many people used it. However, there's new technology, and there's the option to easily perform oximetry integrated into the detail reports. Now, they tend to use very expensive oximeters, but of course they have to use something that's medical grade. So anyway, for all this potential, we'll just have to see. With technology improving, one would hope that there's medical grade oximeters that are not so expensive. Accurate scoring of hypopneas will improve with integration with oximetry. And, you know, I'm sure the audience knows you get lots of information from oximetry, the pulse rate, plethysmography. You can notice the flow regularity and irregularity. All these things could be used to have an index, possibly staging sleep or at least sleep quality. Now, how about physicians? I would say if the device AHI is elevated or the patient's not responding with a normal AHI, you should look at the waveforms. I would say that no algorithm works in all patients, and the physician should tailor the approach based on the patient and the device. In general, I think you should avoid 4 to 20 centimeters of water. This is okay in some patients, but in many, this is not okay. So I would use a higher pressure limit for comfort with high BMI or high pressure requirements. If the patient needs 15 centimeters of water, we don't want to start at 4 or 6. You could intervene for REM events if the a-pap algorithm does not seem to be responding enough. Now, how do you know they're REM events? Well, they tend to occur in clusters. So you could increase the low pressure limit. You could also use a higher low pressure limit in less aggressive algorithm. How about the upper pressure limit? So you could use a lower high pressure limit if there's pressure intolerance, intractable leak, high loop gain, or you could use it in APAP devices with more aggressive algorithms. Other opportunities. Well, you could use a narrow pressure range. A lot of people use a few centimeters up and a few centimeters down from the 90 or 95th percentile pressure. But now this assumes that you think this is correct. A lot of people forget, you can convert to CPAP, and CPAP actually works best in some patients with intractable leak or instability in their breathing pattern or sleep state. Now, while our APAP algorithms tend, they're trying to find the lowest effective pressure. So they lower the pressure, and then there's a vent, and then they raise the pressure. So if all this happens too frequently, you get this pattern of increase, decrease, increase, decrease that may not be good. If a patient stays asleep very well, then this might not be a problem. If they're very arousable, it could be a problem. And of course, we need to minimize large leak. You all know that. I would say consider use of oximetry. I would push the companies to make this available and to make it available at a reasonable price. I think, and I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but efforts to normalize sleep quality are also important. We all focus on the AHI and the adherence, but the truth is that sleep quality on PAP is often poor and may not have improved after starting PAP. So I think this is a new frontier for us in providing PAP therapy. So that's what I have. Thank you very much for your attention.
APAP. It looks like are you still with us? Looks like your mic, your camera is off. I think we may have lost him, which is not good, especially for the Q&A session. I don't know if I can handle that myself. Let's see if he comes back in. I think he might have had a signal issue. So get your questions ready for Dr. Berry. And we will, as soon as he comes back in, we will pop him in here. But let's go over, while he's out, we will go over the CME for our physician friends tonight. The link is already in there. And scroll all the way up. Actually, I'll put it back in for you. Let's see if I can grab that. I'll grab it from over here. Oh, he's back. Let's pop him in. There you are.
Yeah, I didn't touch a thing. I don't know what happened.
Hey, things happen. You know how that is. Yeah, so you covered the challenges and opportunities with APAP and really some of the shortcomings, which any of us who are on APAP know that. And I know there's a lot of opportunity coming, and I know that you've had a hand in helping to build a new algorithm and a new tool with the physicians, sleep res, and also the engineers. And that tool is meant to be much more accurate, much quicker to respond. Can you tell us about that more and the science behind the tool?
It's one thing you learn when you try to design a new one, it's not easy. But they're using some innovative techniques where they model flow, and they actually have flow from a lot of patients. So they actually take actual patient flow, and they see what the PSG scored, and they see what the device scored. So I think this is a very powerful method. You can quickly change the parameters and see what's best. So I think that's very exciting. But at the end of the day, everyone will tell you there's not going to be a perfect APAP algorithm. So you're going to need a physician to review things. But yes, that's the goal. That's very exciting. But equally exciting to me is the ability to collaborate with a program that shows the results of treatment. In other words, that will show detailed waveform data that will be accessible. And not only that, will provide really good education to physicians about what these things mean. And so I'm very excited about that.
Good. Tell me, for those of us who know Dr. Noah, what's it like working with Bill Noah and developing something like this with his group?
It's an experience. But we actually get along quite well.
Oh, he's a tremendous guy. He really
Yes.
is. He's put a lot into.
I'm a tad more sedate. Just a tad.
All right, let's roll into the Q&A, Dr. Berry. Let's see what we got here. Getting a lot of great feedback on your saying how great a presentation it was. Let me scroll up here. This one from Alicia Spangler. What is the best way to explain the difference between APAP and ADAPT SV to patients? I have had 2 patients confuse the two.
Well, the goal is, I mean, they're entirely different. APAP is for obstructive sleep apnea. It's trying to keep the airway open. ADAPT SV, Auto SV, is an adaptive form of BiPAP that's trying to stabilize breathing in people that have, like, for example, Cheyne-Stokes breathing or other causes of central apnea. So it has a backup rate and it has a variable pressure support, entirely different than APAP. So that's what I would say. That in a nutshell, it's just an entirely different animal.
Uncle Nico, all the way from Australia. I have no idea what time it is down
there. Good. I had this in my slides, and I think I either skipped it or accidentally took it out. Yes, that's a good idea. Now, it would be nice to have more inputs than just flow. So you've heard go with the flow. I would say go with the flow, but not only the flow. And I think there's a bunch of other possibilities. You know, there's pads people can lay on. You can bounce sound waves off them. There's just a host of things that you could do. And then if you could put in patient characteristics. So yes, I mean, AI has taken over a lot of things, and there's no reason it couldn't be applied. Yes, you're right.
Nancy Obispo wants to know excessive leaks but normal AHI. Why is that?
Well, the machine is very leak tolerant. It's very leak tolerant. Now, the other thing is the normal AHI might not be right because it's hard to detect events when there's high leak. Now, if you had an oximeter on, you could see whether there's changes in saturation. So even if there wasn't an AHI by flow, there would be an AHI by saturation. And then you'd look back and see, well, these events may be underscored. And so this does happen. I have seen it. Well, fortunately, it happens because a lot of people have excessive leaks. And again, a lot of times the machine is amazing, pretty leak tolerant. But as I said, possible that the AHI is not right.
Looking for a little prognostication here. This is Erica Kennett. And she wants to know, do you believe the integration with oximetry, will ever be available through Apple Galaxy Smart? That's supposed to be watches.
Likely, but it's already available through Oscar and Sleep HQ. Now, the difference is, maybe these aren't medical grade devices. I'm not sure about the device that Sleep HQ use. The device that Oscar commonly uses, the WellU oximeter. And they may not show perfect absolute values, but I think they will show changes in DSATs. So I think it's a good question. One could only hope. Now, we know that consumer technology is just exploded, and it's driving a lot of things. And in a way, I think that Oscar and Sleep HQ are also going to drive things. Again, the industry just has to understand that the public is interested in these things.
Yeah, which oximeter did you say that Oscar was using?
Well, it uses several of them. And by the way, Oscar, it's a complex program. It really is. And all you have to do is Google the apnea board or Google Oscar, and it'll show you how to download it. And it takes a while. I haven't learned every facet of Oscar, or for that matter, Sleep HQ. I'm just learning. But I've been just amazed at how much information there is. So let's hope that less expensive. So supposedly, ResMed, their newest device, S11, will mate with a known oximeter. However, that oximeter is about $1,000.
Hmm.
So you could have one in a lab, so a sleep lab, and you need it, you'd send the patient home. And I'm not necessarily saying that you need the oximetry every night, but you need, obviously the oximetry when you don't know what's going on with the patient.
I know that Massimo also has their new watch, which is medical grade oximetry, but I don't think that thing comes cheap either. I think it's pretty pricey.
Yeah, well, again, Sleep HQ took Apple data from the Apple Watch for sleep, so maybe they can do that. I just think there'll be a push to do these kind of things.
Yeah. Abhay Sharma, there's a tendency for CPAP titration studies to have very high pressures compared to APAP. Do you think we need an update on how if I could say titration, on how titration studies are done in terms of protocols?
Well, it's been mentioned on the prior talks, the airway has some hysteresis. Once it's bigger, in a sense, it can be kept open by lower pressure. So what I mean is that it may take higher pressure to open the airway than to maintain it being open if it's there to begin with. And so in a lot of times, the techs, they have difficult. They have to find masks, and a lot of times they go up very fast on pressure. What I would say is I rarely use the final pressure that they're at. That's what they put down as the recommended pressure. I rarely use it. There was a study by Dr. Kwan and some of his coworkers where they actually looked at the PSG pressure and the 95th percentile pressure at home, and they found suggesting that the pressure was too high. But what I would say is that if you carefully look at the titration, many times they don't need that high pressure. And also, titration protocols usually have drops in pressure. The problem is there's just limited time in some patients. You think everything's great, and then about 5 o'clock they go into REM sleep and have all these events. So it's not easy.
Here's one from Brittany Schaefer. Follow-up care with an educated clinician is absolutely essential for successful dropship APAP. This presentation provides an excellent resource for those navigating compliance and patient success in follow-up outpatient clinic care. More of a comment, but a good comment.
Well, it is a good comment. And so what I would say is yeah, they didn't have a titration, but if you have the right data, you can see how they're doing pretty well, especially if you have oximetry. And, you could make some pressure adjustments and some APAP adjustments. I absolutely agree with you about. So I had some patients that got a recall device, even though I sent the order in to say, I don't know, 10 to 16, they came at 4 to 20. And the patient called me up and said, this machine is killing me. So, I mean, yes, it's a problem. And, but it's also good. You just have to have good communication with the patient. But yeah, this drop ship business is not good for clinical care.
All right. I think that does it for the Q&A portion. I want to thank you for being here, Dr. Berry. Great presentation. You are a gentleman and a scholar. It was great. It was great having you here. And thanks very much.
All right. It's my pleasure.
Take care. All right, guys. So that is the presentation for this evening. Let me take this off the screen. Can I post it, bro? Oh, yeah, absolutely, Nick. Absolutely.